Welcome again to an online PowerPoint lecture thing. This is intended for my students at Anglo-American University in my Pop Culture and Media Theory course, or Popular Culture and Media Theory course at Anglo-American University in Prague, Czech Republic. But if you're not in my course, you're welcome here anyway. I hope you enjoy it and I hope you learn stuff. Jacques Lacan, the famous 20th century French post-structuralist psychoanalyst theorist guy who has had an immense impact on the study of popular culture. And we're going to look not at all of Lacan, but specifically at his account of subjectivity, mirror stage and stuff like that. And towards the end of this, I'm going to apply a Lacanian theory to popular culture, and specifically an audience study of women who read a lot of romance novels. So stay tuned for that. So, what is the subject? And by subject, I mean the self. Like, how do you understand your own identity? That is the central question for Lacan, and the question that motivates a lot of culture. We exist, he said, from a profound sense of lack, and culture is just a means, an endless quest for pursuing unity and meaning that we don't have. Lacan employs Freud's developmental psychology, albeit in a metaphorical way, to explain this quest. And he describes three phases: the mirror phase, the Fort da phase, and the Oedipus complex. So, the mirror phase, when the child is an infant, the child sees no difference between the self and other. That border has not yet been set. But between the ages of 6 and 18 months, the infant, the child, learns to differentiate between herself, himself, and the rest of the world by recognizing its image in a mirror. Or, Lacan says, it could even be the mother's gaze. Anything that, like when the mother says, "There you are," and the baby goes, "Hey, hey, hey," that's the baby recognizing the self in the gaze of the mother, or in the gaze of a mirror, or a reflection of a mirror. And that's why he calls this the mirror phase, or what he called in your reading specular identification, speculum being Latin for mirror. This causes the child joy to see itself as a unified image, because at this stage of its life, the baby doesn't have the coordination and the perceptual acuity, the perceptual faculties, to experience itself as unified. And so it sees itself in the mirror and goes, "Yay, there I am." But Lacan points out this is also a misidentification, because what the child sees is not really the self, but rather an image of the self. That is why Lacan refers to this stage of subjectivity as the imaginary, not pretend, but rather entering the mode of subjectivity where the subject is identified with images. What Freud calls the ego, Lacan says, is actually a construction built up over time precisely by this process of identifying oneself with images, with others, other images. So let me say this another way. The baby points to a mirror and says, even if it can't speak yet, it in effect is saying, "There I am." But that's a misrecognition of itself in the image of an other, something not itself. And we do the same thing throughout our lives all the time. It is a way of building up identity, building up the ego, the conscious sense of self that we have. We say to a job, there I am, but no, that's not me. That's me. That's teaching at a university. Or we look at a relationship and we say, there I am, but no, that's a relationship. That's not the same thing as you. Or we look at a certain philosophy of life, and we say, there I am, but no, that's a set of beliefs and practices. Or we look at a fandom, we say, there I am, but no, that's your fandom. It's not you. Or a set of political beliefs, and we say, no, that's not you. Each of these things is an object, not a subject. Because these things that I identify with are essentially not me, I encounter them, says Lacan, as lack, as absence. The image does not provide the unity that I am looking for, but only a substitute for that unity, a substitute that shows itself to be empty, an empty signifier looking for a signified. Right? Remember Derrida and all that stuff? So the main way that we build up a sense of self is by identifying ourselves with things that are not us. Identifying ourselves with images of our own lack. In Freudian terms, Lacan says, we are trying to find the unity we had when we were with our mother, though Lacan understands mother as a metaphor for an unmediated sense of the real, of truth with a capital T, reality with a capital R. But we're always coming up short. We're never reaching what we search for. Okay, so that's the mirror phase. The second phase is the Fort Da game. And this is actually an interpretation of Freud's interpretation of a child that Freud saw, a toddler, when he was visiting some friends of his. And this toddler was in sort of a crib or a playpen or something. And the mother had tied a spool with twine on it to the playpen so the child could have something to do while the adults talked. And the child would pick up the spool and throw it and go, ooh, and then reel it back in with the twine and go, ah, ooh, reel it back in, ah. And Freud interpreted those childish utterances, the ooh as fort, which means away, and the ah as da, which means there. And so he said that it was a way that the child was dealing with the mystery of the absence of the mother by trying to gain some symbolic control over it. Mommy goes away, fort. Mommy comes back, da. She's there. Mommy goes away, mommy comes back. Mommy goes away, mommy comes back. So it's a way of symbolically mastering the disappearance of the mother. I'm going to make this game where she comes back, and that gives the child a sense of control over it. Lacan's interpretation of Freud's interpretation of this game is that of the child's entrance into the realm of symbols represented by the spool and the thread, these symbolic representations of the mother. And he says that's actually what happens when the child acquires language, the realm of the symbolic, of these symbols we use to communicate. What the child expects, what language promises, what the symbolic promises to him or her, is mastery over the lack, a way to pursue the lack of identity that's at the center of this child's being, the sense of emptiness, and pursuing it through language. At last, I've got a tool where I can pursue this emptiness. But instead, the language only opens a gap between the subject and its identifications, its images that it gets through language. And it is in this gap between the self and the image that desire emerges, a desire that cannot ultimately be fulfilled. Language promises mastery over the lack, a meeting of our desires, but in fact it only intensifies desire and our feeling of alienation. Why? Because once the child enters language, she finds that instead of being its master, it masters her. The symbolic order, language, cultural communication existed before her, and she enters into this structure and is positioned within it, though she is not aware of it. Lacan says that the symbolic order, which he calls the other with a capital O, the other recedes and hides out of our perception. We are rendered subjects by a symbolic order that pre-exists us. We are its object. So we can do no better than to give ourselves a useful fiction of what we are, because there is no essential self. So here's the paradox. Without language, we would have no self, no enunciated self, no self that we could express to others or even to ourselves. But language always threatens to disperse and fragment that subjectivity by revealing it to be a construction of images, dependent upon context, not essential. And like the word now, right? Now seems to have an essential meaning, but it doesn't. It is wholly contextually dependent, right? It's an empty signifier. It depends on whenever I'm saying it. Now means different than now and now, right? In the same way, Lacan uses the word I to illustrate what he means about what happens to us when we pursue our identity. Once I use the word I to mean myself as a subject, I am forced by language to use a sign that is actually an object. It is a verbal placeholder that belongs to others in the same way that it belongs to me. I am made an object of the only system I can use to describe myself as a subject. We are all subjected in pursuing our subjectivity. We are all subjected to the symbolic order that undermines our uniqueness. It even undermines and shapes our unconscious desires, which is why Lacan has this famous phrase, the unconscious is structured like language. The third phase is the Oedipus complex, which Freud used to describe the emergence of sexual desire, sexual difference, but he reinterprets it, Lacan reinterprets it in terms of language. Freud saw in the Oedipus myth a reflection of the sexual desire that the child has for the mother and the instinctual aggression that the child has to the father. He wants to kill the father in order to sexually possess the mother. For Lacan, we seek unity in what he calls the body of the mother, which is a metaphor for this unmediated, direct experience of reality, of truth with a capital T. But our desire to be united with the mother is thwarted. We are forbidden access to the body of the mother, he says, in the name of the father. And that's Lacan's metaphor for the symbol system, the language system, the system of cultural symbols itself. The Oedipus stage is for Lacan a recognition that we can never find wholeness. We can never find an unmediated grasp of the real or the true once we have become structured by language. That is, by the symbol system, the symbolic other, the symbolic order, the father. And think about Derrida, il n'y a pas hors texte. There is nothing outside the text. There is nothing outside of the mediation of language. Rather, every time we think we find something with which to identify a stable, fixed, signified, it only turns out to be another signifier. Lacan says the signifier is always, the signified is always sliding under the signifier. The child's quest for identity must always go unfulfilled. Now, let me give you an example from a study in popular cultural audiences, popular cultural reception from the early 1980s. This is a book by the cultural anthropologist Janice Radway called Reading the Romance, Women, Patriarchy, and Popular Culture. It is a great book. I cannot recommend it highly enough. And an important book in cultural studies. So in the early 1980s, Radway studied a group of middle-class housewives from the Midwest of the United States who sort of formed a little community that gathered round reading a lot of romance books. They lived in this medium-sized city in the Midwest, which she calls Smithton, or Smithtown, in order to keep people's privacy. And all of these women frequent the same bookstore with this lady named Dot who recommends different romance books and stuff like that. And Radway was interested in how these women used this popular entertainment in order to shape a sense of self. And I think she doesn't reference Lacan, but I think it's a really good illustration or model or application of the way Lacan works when applied to popular culture. So the context for the Smithton women's search for identity is the grammar of patriarchy and its oppressive effect on the Smithton women's sense of identity. They feel drained. They feel passive. They feel needed, but not appreciated as interesting, worthwhile people in their own right. Right? They're lacking identity. I want to play you a video from another YouTuber, a woman named Michelle Gages, who I guess was a film student and filmed what she called a visual interpretation of reading the romance. Here we go.
I've prepared this lovely plate of hors d'oeuvres for us.
I just don't know which one to choose.
Well, let me choose for you.
It's delicious.
Would you like another?
No, wait. I'll go first.
Are you nervous?
I'm not nervous. Just afraid of losing control.
Well, when are you gonna do the dishes?
What?
When are you gonna do them dishes?
What?
Callie! Callie!
Oh, yeah, Josh?
When are you gonna do them dishes?
Oh, I'm real sorry, Josh.
Now get up here.
Okay.
It's more like it.
Oh.
That is a brilliant interpretation of where these women are. They're feeling objectified, servant, slave, sexual object, whatever, and they escape into this fantasy realm where they are all of a sudden the center of attention of a man's nurturing affections. So, but in effect, they're not enjoying patriarchy. Let's put it that way. The response of these Smithton women to this oppressive system, this oppressive grammar they find themselves in, is the quasi-subjective act of reading reading romance novels, stealing time for themselves to pursue various identities through these different heroines. Some women reported reading 10 or more of these novels a week, and these are not typically thin novels. They're like big chunky novels. Radway did a survey on the ideal romance, and she learned that these stories often maybe are required to fit, at least for these women, a very stereotypical ideal. The central relationship must be monogamous and heterosexual. There must not be any love triangles to confuse things. Please notice this is the chart of what are the things that should never be in a romance. And rape is like number one, but does not rate, like number one gets 3 points, number two gets 2 points, third most objectionable gets 1 point. But please notice that in the total score, bed hopping actually scores higher than rape, which is, kind of telling. And there are, anyway, let's move on. So also these novels must feature a heroine that is beautiful, fiercely intelligent, has a fiery intelligence, and a fiery disposition that rebels against the expectations of both her parents and society, and all of this without losing her tender-hearted femininity. In the historical romance novels, she's a nurse healing wounded Civil War soldiers and so forth. She must be sexually innocent at the beginning of the book, but not for moral reasons, but rather because she refuses to be used by men. She does not live for their wishes. In other words, the heroine, as the site of reader identification, is a projection of these women's desire to be realized as a fully independent, interesting, and significant human subject, rather than, as opposed to being an object, whether a domestic object, a servant for cleaning up around the house when you're going to do them dishes, or a sex object. The ideal romantic hero must be masculine, a manly man, a leader, and at first he seems harsh and uncaring, but with hints of compassion, and he's sexually experienced because he has not yet found the right woman. And I'm going to play you an ad by Paula Quinn, or by Paula Quinn's publisher, that appeared on YouTube some years ago about one of these books called Lairds of the Mist. And I'm going to pause it every so often to read it because it's not timed well and the text is a little hard to read, but you got to get it. The McGregors have lost everything to their lifelong enemies, the Campbells. But rebel chieftain Callum McGregor refuses to surrender his pride. Or his name. That one's easy to read. Instead, he swears vengeance and death to his enemy and brings it. But when he meets brave, beautiful Kate Campbell, he embarks upon the greatest battle of his life. The one to keep her alive. Kate Campbell has been taught to hate the McGregors. Especially the one they call the devil. But when her life is saved by the chieftain of the hated clan, she learns that a hero can be found in the heart of the most merciless beast. Laird of the Mist by Paula Quinn. Yes, that's how long ago this was, December 2007. So, unfortunately, romance novels are still around. I think they got displaced by vampire novels for a while, and they're not quite as much a thing among 20s and 30s women anymore, as far as I know. But back in the 1980s, believe me, it was a thing. So furthermore, there must be a variety of foils, romantic foils, that is, rivals that serve merely to highlight the ideal characteristics of the heroine and the hero. And of course, there must be villains who threaten the relationship, the sexually manipulative female, the controlling predatory male who only wants sex and not relationship. These stock characters inhabit a highly standardized chiastic, which means X-shaped, like it's a mirror shape, interestingly. A highly standardized chiastic narrative structure, which makes for a tidy, satisfying story. It's a formula. The story always begins with an isolated, emotionally empty heroine who develops relational conflict with the seemingly distant hero, but later that his distance and even cruelty are later revealed as the scars of a past hurt. The heroine, through her feminine will and tenderness, is able to start to bring out the hidden compassion in the hero. The two are then separated by certain events and later reunited, and this finally results in an open declaration of the hero's love for the heroine. I need you, I can't live without you. The heroine responds with emotional and sexual passion, I love you too, and which leads to the happy ending and an implied future marriage and children, perhaps. Perhaps to the children. Note that these stories and the reason why these women readers feel the need to escape into them is centered squarely on identity. The key elements of the story are a female-centered point of view which captures the awakening passion of the heroine as she gradually discovers the depth of the hero's love for her. The story that begins as a crisis of identity, an emotionally empty heroine, ends with a validation of her identity in the admiration and tender care of the hero. That's Radway, page 150. The pathway from identity lost to identity restored is through the transformation of the hero by the heroine from a brutal and uncaring man, the one they call the devil or the beast or whatever, to one who is tender and attentive to her. That's page 127. Radway asserts that the hero-heroine relationship is in reality triadic. That is, in the hero, the heroine finds a combo platter of, on the one hand, the woman's erotic attachment to her heterosexual lover and a pre-Oedipal attachment of a daughter to her nurturing mother. That's on page 135, 136. The transformed hero becomes both a very masculine lover and protector and a motherly nurturer. Right? Remember back to the to that video where he's feeding her the hors d'oeuvres that he prepared, which are essentially, cocktail weenies, but whatever. And he's feeding her. That's part of that motherly nurturing. Here you go, child. Here's your food. So the transformed hero becomes both a very masculine lover, protector, and a motherly nurturer. He validates and cares for her because he realizes that he needs her. The romance reader finds a powerful, vicarious completion of identity in being needed, but in a way that fulfills her desire to be loved, appreciated, desired, admired for her native intelligence, beauty, and character, and cared for by another, unlike the way her role as mother and wife forces her into always caring for others, draining her, being needed, but in a way in which she's never acknowledged as a valuable, interesting individual. In this way, the romance is a powerful wish fulfillment, or what Radway calls a, quote, utopian protest, close quote, against the way patriarchy undermines female identity. That's on page 151. This identity is reconstituted vicariously, primarily through an other relationship, a powerful alternative to relationships as the reader experiences them in real life. Romances change identity through the luminous portrayal of hope and desire, a drama that teeters on the edge of disaster but is saved at the last moment, in a reversal akin to what J.R.R. Tolkien called a eucatastrophe, the sudden reversal of fortune that makes everything okay. That you find in fairy tales and stuff, and in Lord of the Rings. In this text world, a woman can find a home, find community, and find herself, all by finding a man who centers himself upon her needs. This consolation reconfigures identity, and sometimes it really does transform the character of the reader. Some readers in Radway's study reported perceiving themselves as being more assertive and independent, like their heroine, intelligent heroines worthy of love and respect. But please notice how identity is negotiated by these women. And here we can start making the Lacanian themes explicit. Identity for these women comes through identification with an other. From one symbolic other, that is the grammar of patriarchy and the identity reflected back from that mirror, in which the reader is mother, wife, servant, slave, sex object, whatever, these women take refuge in another symbolic structure. That is the structure of the romance novel, which is another type of mirror. But this identification is not finding a real identity. It's not an unmediated grasp of the real, of truth with a capital T. It is at best a partial solution, but one that further fragments identity along patriarchal lines. The woman finds a sense of self by identifying with a heroine who finds her identity in a relationship with a caring man, which turns out to be another other. Further, it is a projected utopian identity, not grounded in reality. There's the promise of the marriage and the happy children and all that. Radway has another chapter on in which she explores what she calls failed romances. That is, books that the Smithton women rejected as bad, and often the books were rejected because they were a little too realistic. For example, the heroine, after a period of time with this caring hero, returns to her husband, perhaps because the author felt that the passionate fantasy couldn't really be maintained indefinitely. The sought-after identity is utopian. It is an identity based on a fantasy world formed out of the raw materials of patriarchy. But it's a patriarchy that is centered on the heroine. The hero is not, for his part, not valued as a unique individual, but is valued insofar as he meets the heroine's needs. Radway says on page 83, quote, "The romantic fantasy is not therefore a fantasy about discovering a uniquely interesting life partner, but a ritual wish to be cared for, loved, and validated in a particular way." It is a projection of a universe in which the heroine, and the romance reader by vicariously identifying with the heroine, is at the absolute center of the erotic and nurturing attentions of the hero. He orbits around her like a planet orbits around the sun. In other words, it is a completely unsustainable identity. It is an empty signifier without a signified. Instead of delivering the promised stable identity, it leaves only desire. And here we can hear echoes of Lacan's Fort da game. So the women who have had desire stirred must return for more and more books. They become addicted. Radway's study focuses on the clientele of a bookshelf community that is all about the romance novels. There's that much demand. Some women consumed, according to Radway, a dozen or more of these novels a week. And look at them. They're big novels. But according to Radway, this fracturing of identity within the fictional world of the romance has several effects. Besides the fact that it always has to be renewed in another book, it can make a woman more assertive of her rights, which might be a good thing, but it also makes her more passive in the face of male indifference or even male cruelty. Remember the feminine patience that brings out the softer, gentler side of the rough, callous, uncaring hero because he was wounded in the past? Radway says that in this way, romance novels they train their readers to interpret male indifference and cruelty as past hurt that needs female healing, as roughness that hides a deeper gentleness, and so forth. And by the way, this is all about James Bond and his gentleness with women. So you can see the various themes of Mirror Stage, Fort da, and the Oedipus complex, the stage that forbids access to an unmediated, authentic self-identity, all in the dynamics of popular reading habits among these romance-reading women. And that's what I got to say about Lacan and subjectivity and how he applies, or at least how I've applied him to popular culture. Thank you for listening, and I will see you guys in class. Be prepared to talk about the reading, which I'll admit was really hard. Lacan's not an easy read, but I think you have enough in you. I believe in you. You can do this. So I will see you in class. Bye-bye. That is a brilliant interpretation of where these women are. They're feeling objectified, servant, slave, sexual object, whatever, and they escape into this fantasy realm where they are all of a sudden the center of attention of a man's nurturing affections. So, but in effect, they're not enjoying patriarchy. Let's put it that way.